So there are various examples of such adaptations that have happened according to the environment in which you live, according to the temperature, according to the pressure conditions, according to the availability of oxygen. Depending on all these factors, the organisms over a period of time evolve and adapt to these conditions. So if you look at this particular diagram, these set of pictures, these are some of the insects or organisms which have adapted themselves to survive. How? For example, monarch butterfly. To ensure that it does not get preyed upon, it tastes foul. And since its taste is foul, the organisms or the animals which prey on these kind of butterflies would not try to touch them. A better example, rather I would say, is viceroy butterfly. It does not do anything, it just mimics how monarch butterflies look. So by doing that, even this could be taken or confused as a monarch butterfly by the animals, and that's why maybe that they will not feed upon the viceroy butterfly. Then you have this basically is a caterpillar called as snake caterpillar. And what happens with snake caterpillar is that its shape changes to look like the head of a snake if you try to go near or try to touch it. So in that case, again, it has survived, or it has made sure that it has a mechanism that ensures that it survives its predator. All these organisms, animals have survived like this over a period of time. So next, continuing on the same discussion, the next thing that we need to discuss is what is habitat and what is niche. Now these two concepts, habitat and niche, are actually a little confusing because more or less they mean the same thing, but there is a small difference between the two. When I say habitat in very simple terms you can say is the address of an organism or home of an organism, natural surrounding of an organism. So this is what habitat is. So the area where an animal lives or is its home, usually an ecosystem or an area within an ecosystem. So habitat relates mostly to the non-living physical or chemical conditions of the area such as temperature, rainfall, salinity, sunlight, soil or elevation. So these kind of factors will basically be related to a habitat. Now in the same habitat, all the organisms do not have the same role. They have different roles. I mean, if you look at this particular picture, the flamingos feed by straining the mud through their bills. Dabbling duck feeds on plants. Avocets feed on the animals. Avocets feed on the insects. Oyster catchers prey on open shells. And plovers hunt for small insects. So if you look at this particular area, this is the same habitat, but each and every one of these birds that we have listed out here have different roles. They have different roles, and this is how you define niche. So we will come back to niche in detail. First, let's do a discussion on what is habitat. So first of all, when we discuss habitat and we say that yes, it is its natural surrounding. So first of all, when we say habitat and we say that it is the natural surrounding of an organism and the area where an animal lives or something that is considered as its home is called as habitat. Now habitat plays a crucial role in preservation of biodiversity because habitat conservation is directly related to the conservation of species in its environment. The protection of habitat is more systematic and comprehensive way of preserving the species. So by protecting any given habitat, a host of species will automatically be protected. This is often more useful than trying to preserve a single species. So rather than trying to preserve a single species, what we need to try and do is that we conserve the habitat in which this species is found, so that not only this species will be saved, but first of all there will be other species that can be saved. Secondly, since it is in its functional role, it is in its natural surrounding, this particular species will have a higher chance of getting preserved. So the loss of habitat is the main cause of species loss in the world, and this is something which is very, very evident if you look at the things that have been happening in the last few years, or let's say last 100 years or so. For example, if you talk about preservation of the mangroves as a habitat, then it protects the plants and animals which are also associated with these mangroves. So it's easier for you to protect the plants and animals that survive there. Coming to the next concept, which is niche. So first of all, niche, as we discussed, we are not just talking about the natural surrounding, but we are talking about the occupation of the organism in its community. So this is what niche can be said to be. So a species niche is composed of its habitat plus the biological or living things found in the habitat. The living component of a habitat is called a community. The biological factors include location on the food chain, predator-prey relationship, and reproductive requirements that that particular individual has. So interrelationships and interactions are important aspects of niche. Interrelationship and interaction. These are the two key words which are associated with niche. Please remember this. So in other words, occupation, you can also say that it is the function of the organism in the ecosystem. So all these organisms will have their own roles. Apart from that, the temporal conditions that are there, for example, the cycle of day and night, the seasonal cycles, these also define the niche of an organism. Now, next discussion that we must have is about specialized versus generalized niche. And why we need this topic to be discussed is mainly because these are the factors which will define whether or not a species can survive for long. How? Specialized niche applies to the species which have very well defined or narrow physical, biological or chemical requirements for its survival. If an organism can only be found within a very limited or specific condition, it is considered to have a very specialized niche. Generalized niche applies to species which can exist in a broad range of conditions. Now, if I take an example, if you know, this is known as a dugong. Now, dugong is a threatened species. And why? You have to ask this, because of its niche. Now, what happens is dugong has a very specialized niche. It requires seagrass. It requires seagrass for its survival. Problem is, with rapid industrialization and development, we have seen a decline in the amount of seagrass that is there in that area. Now what happens is, since seagrass is required, seagrass is absent. Because of absence of seagrass, dugong is facing a threat. So this is what happens. So animals such as dugong, which have very specialized niche, are more susceptible to extinction than an animal which would have a very generalized niche. So generalized niche applies to species which can exist in a very broad range of conditions. Humans are best examples of species with generalized niche. You have other animals also which have generalized niche. You can talk about rats, cockroaches. So these kind of things, even flies you can talk about. So it's very funny that humans can be clubbed in the same bracket as rats, cockroaches or flies, because all these are organisms which can survive in any kind of niche, or they have generalized niche. Next, niche and ecosystem changes. Why we are discussing this? Understanding of the niche of species within an ecosystem will be very, very important, which will provide us insights to what can be the consequences of the change of a habitat or niche of an organism. So two of the more common changes are the elimination of species and introduction of exotic or foreign species, which is called as invasive species. Now, removal of a species, whether through extinction or through habitat loss, can have many undesirable effects. Another case can be pesticides. What happens with pesticides? Whenever you spray a pesticide, you'll definitely kill the harmful insects, but as well as the beneficial ones also get killed in the process. So the result of spraying pesticide can be removal of a very important predator of an harmful insect, and that's why it can actually increase the population of pest in that area. So all this is a possibility. So that's why understanding the niche of various organisms in a given habitat will help us understand the effect of change that happens in that given area. So the introduction of these two, that is an exotic or foreign species, non-native species, can also become very dangerous for organisms. So let's say if the introduced species is known to be very resilient and competitive and has a very generalized niche, there is a possibility that it will take over, or it will not let any other species which has specialized niche to survive. So that can happen to the native species. And there are many such examples. We'll just come to it in some time. So if I have to conclude and summarize what is the difference between habitat and niche, first of all, understand that habitat is a place or a part of ecosystem occupied by a particular organism. The role of an organism within its environment or ecosystem will be called as its niche. So it is a physical place, and it is the function or activity of the organism. Reflects the living place of an organism, reflects its biotic and abiotic association with the environment in terms of its diet, reproduction, and other activities. So this is how we can differentiate between habitat and niche. Now the next thing that we need to look at is how do organisms interact with one another. We have seen that they have a functional role in the habitat, that is called as niche. We know that there is an interaction that is happening. There is a competition at times between these organisms, but in how many ways do these organisms interact? This is the next thing that we will look into. Now the thing is, if you talk about the ways of interaction, this is something which is a must. Without interaction, can you think of any natural habitat on this earth which is just inhabited by one single species? There isn't, right? So there is no such habitat, and even such a situation is unthinkable. For any species, the minimal requirement is that one or more species should be there on which it can feed upon. Even a plant species which can make its own food cannot survive alone, right? So it needs soil microbes, for example, to break down the organic matter in the soil and return the inorganic nutrients for absorption. And then think of pollination. Can pollination happen without the help of an animal? It cannot. So it is obviously, so it becomes very obvious that even for small things, since these all organisms are dependent on one another, they cannot survive alone. So the interaction, whatever we just took an example of, it's, you can say, a beneficial or a positive interaction. But interactions can also be negative, and we'll see what kind of negative interactions we can have. So interactions can either be positive or be negative. It can either be positive for both, negative for both, positive for one and negative for another one. It can be, you can say, neutral for one and positive for another, neutral for one, negative for another. All these kind of possibilities exist, and all these different scenarios that we have is what we will discuss in this part of the lecture. So the first one is predation. So just imagine what would happen to all the energy that is fixed by autotroph organisms if the community has no animal to eat the plants. If there are no herbivores, how would the energy transfer from the plant to the other animal? So you can say that predation is nature's way of transferring the energy from the lower trophic level to higher trophic level. Lower to higher trophic level. What is trophic level? We'll just come back to it. An autotroph to a heterotroph. Autotrophs, the organisms which produce their own food, and heterotrophs, the organisms which depend on the food made by other organisms for their survival. So the energy transfer of autotrophs to heterotrophs is happening in predation. That one organism is a prey and the other organism is a predator. So what is a prey and what is the predator? Prey is something which is being eaten, and predator is the one that eats. So this is what happens. Now generally when we hear the term predator, most probably we think of a carnivore like a tiger or a lion, But even if I talk about a deer, even deer is a predator. Even deer can be said to be a predator because it has a prey which is the plant. Even if you talk about a sparrow which is eating fallen seeds from the plants, even that is a predator, mainly because it is preying on the seeds. So although animals eating plants are considered separately as herbivores, they in a broad sense are actually predators only. So you just have to remember this. So for plants, herbivores are the predators. Nearly 25% of all the insects are known to be phytophagous. That is, they feed on the plant sap and all other parts of the plant. Now, a few things have to be considered here. First of all, what if the predator is very efficient? So, if the predator is very efficient and over exploits its prey, then the prey might become extinct, and following it, the predator will also become extinct for the lack of food. So, first of all, what will happen? That if the predator is much more efficient than it should be, or what nature allows it to be, then in that case, it would finish off all the prey that exists there. Once it does, it would not have food for itself. And once it does not have food for itself, it would also not survive. So this is what would happen if the predator is over efficient. Now, so what happens is sometimes when certain exotic species or invasive species are introduced into a geographical area, they become invasive. Why they become invasive? Because they start spreading fast. And why does it spread fast? Because the land does not have natural predators. And there are many examples of it around the world, that when a particular species was introduced into a certain geographical area and it took away all the prey from that area, and the habitat was completely disturbed. And that has happened a lot of times in many areas of the world. So let's say the biological control methods that are adopted in agricultural pest control are based on the ability of predator to regulate the prey population. So predators also help in maintaining species diversity in a community. By doing what? By reducing the intensity of competition among the competing prey species. Now another scenario that may arise is that what if the predator is inefficient? Because if the predator is inefficient, it means that it would have a negative effect on one level below that predator. So for example, let's say the lions are inefficient. What would it mean? It would mean that the deer population will rise. And if the deer population rises, it would have a negative impact on the grassland or on the area where the deer are present. So even if one organism is not efficient enough, or if it is more efficient than what it should be, then both the cases are not very ideal, and this is what happens in case of predation. So we took the example of monarch butterflies, that they are highly distasteful to the birds. Now because of a special chemical present in their body. Now interestingly, the butterfly acquires this chemical during its caterpillar stage itself by feeding on poisonous weed. So if you look at this diagram, if we revisit the same diagram, we talked about monarch butterflies, and this is what happens with monarch butterflies. Now we just discussed 5 minutes back about the fact that for the plants, herbivores are predators, and 25% of all the insects are known to be phytophagous. Now this is a condition which is not ideal for plants. Why? Mainly because plants cannot move. If it was an animal, over a period of time it will run away from its predator, but plants cannot. So that's why plants generally have an evolved way of defending themselves against the herbivores, and they can do this in various ways. For example, many of the plants produce and store chemicals that make the herbivores sick when they are eaten. So over a period of time, these herbivores will stop eating these particular kinds of plants. They can even kill it. They can even kill the herbivores. So the herbivores will try to avoid these kind of plants. So even a large number of commercial products also that we have, that we extract from the plants. Very simple examples: nicotine, caffeine. So if you take these examples, these originally were supposed to be defense mechanism for the plants against its predators, that is all the grazers in the fields. But we extract these things. So now doing that on a commercial level might also again create an imbalance in the environment or the habitat. Now the next kind of interaction that we observe in nature is competition. Now what is this interaction, competition? So very first thing, please understand that a process in which the fitness of one species is significantly lower in the presence of another species is called as competition. Now what happens is, there are two organisms A and B. Their food requirements are same. For A and for B, the food requirements are same, but the fitness of B is much greater than fitness of A. So what will happen is, B will consume more of the food which is available in a given area than A would be able to do. So over a period of time, what will happen is that A will cease to exist. Over a period of time, A will cease to exist, mainly because B is much more stronger and is able to occupy or get all the food from a given area. So this is what happens in competition. So a process in which the fitness of one of the species is significantly lower in the presence of another species. So now what will happen is, you will see there are many areas where two or more organisms which may not be related, because there are theories that say that competing species should be related, but that cannot be the case, that may not be the case. For example, if you look at this particular diagram, we are talking about flamingos. So flamingos as well as fish which are there in the water and flamingos which are there on the ground, they both compete for the same food. Now if the population of any one of them is higher, or if any one of them is stronger than the other one, then what will happen is, one of these two species will stop to exist, because they were competing with an organism which was much more stronger than the other. So this is what happens. So that's why I am saying that it is generally believed that competition occurs when closely related species compete for the same resources which are present in a given geographical area, and this number of resource should be limiting. If the resource was limiting, it becomes much more of a problem. So but this is not true. Firstly, as you see in this particular example, totally unrelated species could also compete for the same resource. And secondly, as this example itself shows, that resources need not be limiting all the time for competition to occur. So what may happen is that the consumption of one species may get lowered and the second species may be able to get more out of the same area. So the other one would be limited, but it does not mean that the second will altogether go extinct. It may, if the resources are limited, but if the resources are not limited, they may coexist very easily. So you can note down this point, that if the resources are limited, the competitively stronger species will eliminate the weaker one. But if the resources are limited, obviously there is a possibility that one organism may go extinct. For example, the abundant tortoise. If you look at this picture, this is a picture of abundant tortoise. Now what happened is, this particular species of tortoise became extinct within a decade after goats were introduced on the island where they used to survive. So basically it is supposed that the goats had greater browsing capacity, and that is why this became extinct. Another evidence for the occurrence of competition in nature is something which is called as competitive release. Competitive release. So what exactly competitive release means? If you look at this particular line, a species whose distribution is restricted to a small geographical area because of the presence of a competitively superior species is found to expand its distributional range dramatically when the competing species is experimentally removed. So if we remove the superior species, then the weaker species will expand its distributional range dramatically. This is what would happen. So in general, what we have seen is that herbivores and autotrophs, that is herbivores and plants, they appear to be more adversely affected by competition than carnivores do. Apart from that, there is one more concept that you should know, is something called as competitive exclusion principle. It's called as competitive exclusion principle. So what exactly does it say? It says that if there are two closely related species which are competing for the same resource, they cannot coexist for indefinite amount of time, and the competition will eliminate the inferior of the two. So what it says is that two closely related species competing for the same resource can't coexist indefinitely, and the competitively inferior species will be eliminated. So this is what happens if there are two closely related species, because first of all, since they are closely related, they'll always confine themselves to the same geographical area. So obviously they will compete against one another. So this is what we know. Now even this may be true if the resources are limited. And there are some recent studies which have shown that this kind of generalization is not very true about competition. So what they point out towards is that species which are facing competition, they might evolve mechanisms which may promote coexistence rather than the exclusion of that species. So one such mechanism is something called as resource partitioning. What is resource partitioning? If two species compete for the same resource, they could avoid competition by choosing different environments or different conditions, for example different times for feeding or different feeding patterns. So all this is possible. And one of the scientists, MacArthur, he actually even showed this experimentally, that 5 species which are related to each other living on the same tree were able to avoid competition and coexist due to behavioral differences in their foraging activities. Their foraging activities. What is foraging? This is search for food. So that's why this is possible. So one more example of the fact that we just discussed, if you look at Notonecta waterbug and Coryxia waterbug. Now these are two related species. These are two related species which actually even share the same habitat, but their niche is completely different. So although they are related species, very similar to one another, they have many similar adaptations to the habitat they share, but their niche is completely different. For example, Notonecta is an active predator, a secondary consumer eating other invertebrates, tadpoles and even small fish. Coryxa, in contrast, Coryxa feeding on algae and rotting vegetation. So completely different. So in a way you can say that it is a primary consumer and this is a secondary consumer. So the two water bugs can therefore survive side by side because they exploit completely different resources in the environment. So this is a possibility. The next kind of interaction that we need to discuss is parasitism. Now what is parasitism? First of all, let me start with a picture of a mosquito, a misleading picture, because I think in very simple terms, whenever you talk about parasites, we do discuss mosquitoes, but all mosquitoes are not parasites. The female mosquitoes are not considered parasites. Why not? We'll just come to that once we discuss what exactly is parasitism. So first of all, it is a relationship between species where one organism, the parasite, lives on or in another organism, the host, causing it some harm and is adapted structurally to this way of life. Now what happens is many of the parasites have evolved to be very specific to their hosts in such a way that both the host as well as the parasite, they tend to co-evolve. That is, if the host evolves special mechanisms for rejecting or resisting the parasite, even the parasite has to evolve mechanisms so that it can counteract and neutralize them in order to be successful with the same host where it is living with. So in accordance with their lifestyles, the parasites evolved special adaptations such as you can say loss of unnecessary sense organs, presence of adhesive organs or suckers to cling on to the host, loss of digestive system, high reproductive capacity. All these kind of adaptations have come in the parasites so that they can survive with the host. So please make a note of these points. First, adaptation that we are talking about is loss of unnecessary sense organs. Second, loss of digestive system. Third, adhesive organs so that they can cling onto the host. And apart from that, you can also talk about high reproductive capacity. So they have undergone these kind of adaptations so that they can live easily with its host. So the life cycle of the parasite is also very complex at times. It may involve at least one or two intermediate hosts at time. For example, you talk about the human liver fluke. If we discuss human liver fluke. So basically human liver fluke, it depends on two intermediate hosts, one being a snail and after that a fish. So these are two intermediate hosts on whom it depends on completing its life cycle. Even you talk about the malarial parasite. So the malarial parasite needs a vector, that is a mosquito, to spread to other hosts. So the majority of the parasites, they harm the host. They may reduce the survival and growth, reproduction, etc. of the host. They may reduce even the population density of the host by killing many of them. Also, what they may do is that they may make the host more vulnerable to predators by making the host physically weak. So all these kind of things are associated with parasitism. Now, one more thing, something that we started the discussion with, is mosquito a parasite? Now, many a times the female mosquito is not considered as a parasite. Why? Mainly because it does not depend on the host. I mean, if you call the humans as the host, then this female mosquito does not depend on the humans for its survival. It may bite you, it may suck the blood, but it will go away. It does not depend on you for its survival. So that's why female mosquito is not considered a parasite, even though it needs our blood for its reproduction. Now, we have discussed two keywords here, on or in another host organism. So if the parasite is living on the host organism, then you call it ectoparasite. And if it lives inside, then you call it endoparasite. So these are the two kinds of parasites that we have. So the life cycle of endoparasites are more complex than ectoparasites, mainly because of their extreme specialization. Their morphological and anatomical features are greatly simplified while emphasizing their reproductive potential. Now, another example of parasitism can be the bird quail. You might have heard of the fact that quail lays its eggs in the nests of other birds. Now, what has happened over a period of time is that the egg of quail has started to resemble the egg of its host. So, if it is laying the eggs in the nest of, let's say, a crow, in that case, what has happened, for adapting to this basically host, here you can call the crow as the host. So the eggs of quail now resemble pretty much the eggs of crow, so that the eggs can survive with the eggs of crow. So this is another kind of parasitism, and it is called as brood parasitism. Then after that, the next kind of interaction that we have is commensalism. So what do we mean by commensalism? This is a kind of interaction in which one species benefits and the other is neither harmed nor benefited. So if you look at this picture, what exactly do you see here? Now, why these many birds are here on the ground? Mainly you have to understand here that one species benefits. These birds are benefiting. It has no effect on the survival of this particular species. Why? Mainly because these domesticated animals are here for feeding, and once they feed on the grass, they uproot the grass. Once they uproot the grass, many a times the insects which will be the food for these birds, they also get uprooted along with the roots of these grasses, and this is what these birds will be feeding upon. So the birds are getting benefited here, and while this particular animal is just going along with its normal functioning of day-to-day life, its eating habits. So this bird is called as cattle egret. The second picture that you see here is of zebra shark and remora. This basically is also a kind of commensalism. What happens is this zebra shark is unaffected, but by attaching itself to the zebra shark, remora basically protects itself from the predators. And apart from that, sometimes it is also called as mutualism. Many of the things, like let's say the microbes which may exist in this area, or some things that may affect the skin of zebra shark, that all gets eaten up by remora. But more of it, I mean, this is not a very big thing for zebra shark. It's not a very big benefit. Most of the benefit actually goes to remora, and that's why it is also called as commensalism. Then the next one that we come to is mutualism. What is mutualism? Interaction confers benefits on both the interacting species. For example, lichens represent an intimate mutualistic relationship between a fungus and a photosynthesizing algae or cyanobacteria. Similarly, the mycorrhiza are associated between fungi and the roots of higher plants. So this is another mutualism. The fungi helps the plant in the absorption of essential nutrients from the soil, while the plant in turn provides the fungi with energy yielding carbohydrates. So this kind of thing where there is a win-win situation between the two organisms, this is called as mutualism. Now the most significant mutualism example that we have is between the plant and animal. Plants need the help of animals for pollinating their flowers, and in turn the food is being provided by the plant to the animal. It can be in the form of a pollen, a nectar, a fruit, etc. But mutually both are being benefited. So these two examples can be seen as a part of mutualism between plant and an animal. Now many a times there is also a concept of cheaters. Why? For example, what may happen is an animal can try to steal the nectar without aiding in pollination. So that's why what has happened is that over the course of evolution, the plant and animal have been linked with one another. Then the next kind of interaction that we have is amensalism. What is amensalism? It is just opposite of commensalism. So in commensalism we talked about the fact that one is benefited, second organism has no effect. In amensalism, one gets affected negatively, second has zero effect. So whenever that's the case, you call it amensalism. So any relationship between organisms of different species in which one organism is inhibited or destroyed while the other organism remains unaffected. So this is what happens in amensalism. Eucalyptus. So what happens with the areas where eucalyptus is being grown? We see that if eucalyptus is being grown, it takes up all the water in that area and there is nothing left for the other organisms. So although for eucalyptus it is nothing as such, it's not a parasitism. that it is not trying to feed upon other organisms, or it is not competing with other organisms. It is its natural course of feeding. But with that, what happens is the other organisms, they see a shortage of water, and that's why they cannot survive for long if they need good amount of water. So this is an example of amensalism. So to summarize, what you need to understand is that all these kinds of interactions that we have discussed, these all have some positive effect in some, and they have negative effect on some. So just to summarize, when we discussed mutualism, we are talking about the fact that both the species are having a positive outcome out of it. In commensalism, one species is gaining, the second species does not have any effect. In competition, both will lose. So it is minus minus. Then in amensalism, one will lose, the second will have no effect. In predation, one will gain, second will lose. And finally in parasitism, one will gain and the other will lose. So all these kind of interactions where either both are losing or one is losing and one is winning, these are called as negative interactions. And the rest are called as positive interactions. So you can say that mutualism, commensalism, these two are positive responses and these four are negative responses. Apart from that, we have another one which is very rarely discussed, is neutralism. And in neutralism, both the species A as well as B will have no effect on each other. So that's why we generally don't discuss this part.